Welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. This week we're thinking about the transfiguration and also about questions that we have around all sorts of things. And I've been thinking about how, especially in a rural community, the questions about the church are often just stored with the vicar and in the vicar's brain. So people will expect the vicar to know all about churchyard regulations. They'll expect the vicar to know all about issues with the building. They'll expect the vicar to know all about weddings. They'll expect the vicar to know all about safeguarding. They'll expect the vicar to know all about the rota. They'll expect the vicar to know about all these sorts of things. And in many cases, the vicar will know the answer to those questions, although they might not. But that's not really the best way for the community of the church to work. It's better if there's at least one, possibly two people in each church community who also know the answers to all those questions. So you might have somebody who's a specialist on the churchyard, or someone who's a specialist on the building, or someone who knows all about safeguarding. That technically should be your safeguarding officer, whoever that person is. There should be someone who is also an expert on the rota and how the rota works for your church community, how that works in each place, because yes, your vicar may know the answer to all those questions, and that's great, but it's better if that repository of knowledge is within the church community. So next time you want to ask your vicar a question about something and then you know the answer, have a think about whether that could be the thing that you could be the expert for, because there will come a time when your vicar will need to move on, and then during the vacancy that knowledge may be lost, and it may be that if a new person comes to look after you as a clergy person, that they will need to be briefed on the answers to the questions, that they might not know the answers to the questions in your particular locality. So this is a plea for us to, when we have questions, that's brilliant, but also to share the knowledge so that the answers are held corporately within the church community, not just in the vicar's head. This week's thought for the week is based on the transfiguration story in Mark 9. That's our set reading for gospel reading for this week for the Sunday just before Lent. It's called the Sunday next before Lent, but it is the Sunday just before Lent. So the transfiguration is a really interesting story. In summary, Jesus takes Peter and John up the mountain, and Jesus is transfigured up the mountain. He turns, his clothes are described as dazzling white. There's this big effect. Moses and Elijah appear to be talking to Jesus. God speaks to the disciples and says, "This is my son, whom I love. I'm pleased with him." All that sort of repetition from the baptism. Peter, wanting to be practical, offers to make some tents or shelters for one each for Moses, Elijah and Jesus, and Jesus says no, that's fine. And then Jesus speaks to Moses and Elijah. The disciples can't hear what's going on, and then it passes and they go back down the mountain, and Jesus says to them, "Don't talk about this to anyone." And the transfiguration is a passage which always in my mind brings up many more questions than answers. So many more questions than answers. I mean, why does Jesus go white and shiny? Is he a vampire? No, Jesus is not being a vampire. But why was that necessary? Why was this brightness necessary? Why did Peter decide they need tents? Why did they go up a mountain? What were Moses and Elijah saying to Jesus? Why did he need to hear it? So I guess the tents question, a mountain question, those are ones which we might have a bit of access into. So both Moses and Elijah really liked mountains. Liked might be too strong. God met with Moses up a mountain, and when God met Moses up a mountain to deliver the commandments, to work all that out, it took a long time. It took 40 days. That's why Peter thought they might need shelters. But it wasn't going to be like that. But Peter didn't know. He was offering out of his experience, but something new was happening. So he just had to think about that. So that's probably why Peter suggested the tents. Elijah had met God, encountered God up a mountain as well. And obviously they wanted to be in a place where there weren't crowds. We don't know which mountain it was. The person who wrote the gospel down actually either didn't know or didn't think it was important for us to know, which is fine. The other question, kind of the sort of burning question, is why do this? Why do Moses and Elijah come to talk to Jesus at this particular time? What did they need to say to Jesus that Jesus didn't know? And this is part of the big question, the big theological question of, if Jesus is fully God and fully human, how does he know things? Does he know everything that God knows? And if he did that, how could he be fully human? That's a great big theological question. And we see in the story of Jesus working things out that Jesus's opinion about things seems to change sometimes in ways that make him more human. But we have in our theology that Jesus is truly God as well. So big theological question. It says in the Luke telling of the transfiguration that Moses and Elijah were talking to Jesus about what was going to happen to him. So it's implied they're talking about his death and resurrection and what was going to happen then. And they're discussing that, kind of maybe even like a pep talk for Jesus, although that seems kind of a strange thing. But we don't know exactly what they said to Jesus. And there's lots of questions. There's lots of questions about this story in the Transfiguration. This story is often not put in children's Bibles because it's considered that it's not necessary, or maybe because there just would be more questions than answers for it. So it's not put in there. Often at funerals, I talk about Thomas, and Thomas is one of my favourite disciples, possibly my favourite, because he asks the questions which everyone else is thinking but aren't brave enough to ask. So when Jesus says that he's going to prepare a place for the disciples and that they know the way to the place where he's going, and Thomas is the only one brave enough to say, Jesus, but we don't know the way. And Jesus says to Thomas, I am the way, the truth and the life. And he's saying to Thomas that it's okay if you don't know the way. I'm going to work it out for you. I'm going to make the way for you. But he does not give Thomas a map and directions. He just says, it's okay if you don't understand. It's going to be all right. And often when we have questions about theological issues, we wonder, we like, I don't understand this. And sometimes Jesus just has to say to us, it's okay if you don't understand. It's going to be okay. And so we have lots of questions, and we'll work through lots of questions during Lent. And it's okay if we don't understand those questions, or the answers to those questions, because what Jesus is doing as we listen to his story through Lent and Easter is working things out for us, even if we don't grasp the answers to all the difficult questions that we have. The Dibley moment for the week this week is a very simple Dibley moment, not necessarily hugely comedic, but the sort of moment that you might have had in The Vicar of Dibley. So I was making a sheep biscuit with a child. If you want to know how to do that, you have a biscuit, you use icing and mini marshmallows, a giant chocolate button face and some chocolate stick legs. That normally works pretty well. Anyway, this child had obviously been waiting to ask me a question. So the question this child asked me was, who made God? And that's the sort of question that can put adults into an absolute flap. Child asks, who made God? Question that most people have at some point in their lives. Who made God? Simple answer, nobody made God. God has always been there. The child had no follow-up questions to that answer. Child was perfectly happy with that answer. Even though it wasn't detailed, It didn't put in any long explanation, it didn't have any story. Simple question, there was on that time, simple answer, end of story, no panic, back to the sheep biscuits. That's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, have a really blessed week, and that for your questions you find answers or reassurance that you don't actually need to understand everything.